Hey guys, I'm Charles Neal. I've been finishing since I was 13 and I'm now soon to be 57. And like most woodworkers, I started out really not knowing any different, and I started out using pine. And I had all kind of issues and problems finishing it, and I really didn't understand why. And I dare say that most woodworkers start out with pine, and many still use it for secondary wood today or as a primary. It's relatively inexpensive, pretty easy to obtain. And typically you'll go to the box store and buy some pine. So I did just that. I went to the box store and I bought some pine. Now the first thing you have to know is pine is a word that's used to describe a whole host of actually different woods. You've got spruce and fir and yellow pine and ponderosa pine and hemlock, and the list is endless. It just, any conifer tree is basically referred to as pine. And it comes in all kind of different grades and whatever, and we're going to take a very quick look at it. When you go to a box store and you buy a 1x12, the first thing you're going to notice is it's not an inch thick and it's not 12 inches wide. That's what's referred to as the nominal thickness, meaning that's where it started. You know, when you buy a 2x4, it's not 2x4. It's 3.5 by 1.5. But it started out 2 inches by 4 inches. The reason being is that once it was kiln dried and then machined or processed to be straight and flat, that's how much wood was removed, and that's the size it comes down to. When you buy wood from a hardwood supplier who's selling it to you in the rough, or you go to a mill, it's going to be sold in what's called quarters. Meaning, if they tell you it's 4/4, that means it's an inch thick. There's 1/4 of an inches in an inch, so it's called 4/4. If it's 1.25 inches thick, it's 5/4. If it's 8/4, it's 2 inches thick. But that's the nominal size. That means that's the size it was cut in. A 4/4 piece of material is designed to yield you a 3/4 inch thick piece of material. A 5/4 is typically going to give you a 7/8 to an inch. And up the scale it goes. So that's kind of the basic terminology. The box store, when you buy material, it's going to already be surfaced and finished for you. Finished meaning it's already to its given size. So you're going to see a 1x12 be 11.5 or whatever it is by 3/4 of an inch thick. If you can buy wood from a rough mill, meaning in the rough, and you have a planer to where you can surface the wood, it's much more economical. But many don't. So again, they go to the box store and they buy pine. There's several kinds. When you buy pine, this is not a super good example, but you can see the rough surface on this. This is exactly what it would look like. It's rough. You can see the sticker marks where it was put up in the kilns to be dried and whatever. And then when you plane it, you have a nice, clean, smooth surface. Well, you're supposed to. Anyway. But when you go into a box store, again, there's all kind of different grades. And I got to be honest, it's been a long time since I went in a box store and bought pine. And I was kind of amazed at what I seen. And I was amazed at the price. I really was. This is poplar. Now, some box stores you can find panels of poplar, and if you do, they're going to be more expensive than the pine. But you can go to the sawmills and to the wood specialty stores, and they're going to carry poplar. Poplar has been around forever. And personally, in my opinion, it's a far better wood to begin woodworking with than pine. Pines are typically very difficult to finish, and they're not the easiest to work, oddly enough. They're very soft. So usually a lot of them, at least a little nick or ding, and you got a dent or whatever. The resin in pine, or the sap, if you will, is also very hard on your tools and your blades. But one common denominator that you see in almost all pines, and in most any wood actually, is knots. The simple rule is avoid them where possible. But when you can't, there's some things you need to know. If you're looking at a piece of pine at the mill or in a box store, or basically any wood, and around that knot you see a dark area, and the knot is very black or dark, odds are that's what's called a loose knot, meaning it's not going to stay in the board. You can see it all the way around. If you're sawing something, particularly on a table saw, skill saw, anything, and you hit that knot has the potential of coming out of that piece of wood, and it's going to come out just like a missile, and it can do you some damage. It really can. They're hard. They're extremely hard. They're also very difficult to finish. They're very difficult to sand over, because literally what a knot is just an end grain. It's another piece of wood growing through the side. But this is a piece of white pine that I got at the box store, shelving board. It's 6 foot long. I paid $9.64 for it here in Virginia. That equates to $1.60 a board foot. And that's how wood is basic. These are sold in linear footage, I think. It's so much for the length of foot. That's the way the box stores do it. The way the mills do it is in board footage. A board foot is 12 inches square by 1 inch thick. So if you buy a 12-inch square piece of 8/4, you actually have 2 board feet because it's 1 inch thick. Now, a simple calculation is you measure the width of the board times the length in inches and divide it by 144. That's going to tell you how many board feet are in that piece of wood. Then, depending on how much they're charging a board foot, gives you an idea what you're going to be paying. But again, that's 1 inch thick. If this piece of wood was 5/4, then you've got to multiply it again by 1.25 because it's a 1/4 inch bigger. I think I got the calculation right. But you get the point. Anyway, then I got another piece of pine while I was there, and it's actually hemlock pine. And it's clean, clear, nice grain and everything. And it's 6 foot. This piece of wood I paid $22.84 for. That equates to $3.80 a board foot. A lot of places you can buy cherry for that. But you have to be able to process it. And some mills do have planing services and what's called straight line surface. So they will plane, a lot of them will plane to dimension what you want. And so, you know, it just depends on where you're looking at. Here's a little 6-foot one that was, I don't know, this, see here, it's 1 by 6 by 6. Seeing better pine. Well, it's hemlock too. But it's clean and clear. And it came up to 364 board foot. Poplar, an average on poplar right now, and of course it fluctuates with the market, is $1.25 to $1.50, some places $1.60. And if you order it and have it shipped, typically right now you're going to average $1 to $1.25 a board foot having it shipped. So if you do the math and you're paying, let's assume you're paying $1.60 a board foot for poplar, and then you got to pay another $1.25 to have it shipped. I think you're what, $2.85? You're still cheaper than buying pine. Does poplar finish better? Yes, it does, but it has its own little issues too. But we'll take a look at that. But these are two woods that are kind of down on the price side. I mean, these are some of the lesser expensive, particularly if you can go to a mill and get it. Other woods that are relatively inexpensive are aspen, alder. They're just a lot less expensive. Then I got to be honest with you, I couldn't help but laugh when I mean, I could not believe this. You guys got to see this. Whoops. It looks like every knot that was cut out when they were processing is now glued up in little hunks all over the place to make a board. And in a lot of places you've got two butt joints. And that's just where two end grains are coming together and they're glued. I saw it into them. There's nothing in there. There's no biscuits. It's just glued. But I can't imagine the time, even if it was a machine, that all the filler and the knots. Now this is what's called a paint grade. They don't waste one bit of it. I mean, they literally glued all them knots back together to make a board. And I don't know, it was $6, $7, something like that. I'm going to tell you what, I walked past that and laughed and could not believe it. And I actually turned around and went back and bought it because I said, you know, nobody can believe it. Then, this is called a stain grade. And while it's a lot better than that one, we've still got all these little blocks. Now these aren't little blocks. I mean, you can see all the grain, you know. But these are nice and clear. I guess these are the good parts that were cut out to get that board. So that board's got all the uglies, and this one they made sure didn't have uglies in it, except you got all these glue lines. Now I don't have a piece of yellow pine here, but that's exactly what this is. This sheet of 1/4-inch pine plywood, it's yellow pine. One of the other things you're going to see in pine is what is often referred to as winter and summer grain, or a better definition is simply put, hard and soft. And when you look at the dark line in here, that's a hard grain. When you see the white or lighter color, that's a soft grain. Basically, it comes from, the way I understand it, basically where it comes from is that as the tree, you know, the tree grows faster in the summer than it does in the winter. In the winter, you get a denser, harder grain. Makes sense, but I can't tell you that's exactly so, but I can tell you this much. It definitely exists in the wood. And even in wearing, you know, if you use pine or yellow pine particularly for a set of stairs or something, as it wears, you're going to see the soft grain wear faster than the hard grain. It just does. All of your pines are classified as a softwood. You've got sugar pines and these are almost as soft as a balsa wood. White pine is typically pretty soft. On the other hand, yellow pine is usually pretty hard, pretty dense wood. As well, you've got what's called a ponderosa pine. This thing is heavy and dense. This is typically a western wood. Now, you can very definitely see the winter and summer or hard and soft grains in this. Now that presents us an issue, big time. And the reason it presents an issue is that when we dye it or stain it, what's going to happen is the softwood is going to absorb the color far more readily than the hard grain. But it also has another issue, and that issue is being able to sand it. When you run a sander over this, what you're going to run into is that the sander is going to try to, it's going to take out the soft grain far easier than it's going to take out the hard grain. And you can just get a washboard surface. There's a couple alternatives to that. First off is do what we call a construction grade sanding, meaning you want to take a coarser paper, something like maybe an 80 or a 120, and do your sanding, leveling first. Get that done. Then come back with your finer papers and do a very, very light sanding. Now you want to get all the scratches out, obviously. But something like 80 or a coarser paper it's going to ignore more so the hard grain than the soft. It's just going to cut. Think of it like building a road. If you came in and you've got big rocks in the road bed and you've got a fine rake out there and you're raking, you can move the dirt around the rock, but you're not going to move the rock. On the same token, if you come in with a nice big bulldozer, bulldozer's going to cut the rock, the dirt, and everything. That's kind of the premise of using a coarser grit paper to get your leveling and everything done. Then come back with the finer grades and do your smoothing. Now, the other alternative is something that is mechanical. Something like a cabinet scraper. A cabinet scraper will let you go over, and it's slicing, it's cutting, meaning it's going to level, and because of the wide surface, it's going to get right over top. I could sharpen this one a little more, I think, but you get the point. What I've got here is I've got a piece of this, and we actually just put a yellow dye on it. And I just want to show you this. I'm going to scrape it a little bit, just take the top off. And notice what I've got. What I've got here is I've got all the soft grain. You can see how definite, how much color it's absorbed. And when I scrape it, it's coming right off the top of the hard grain. That's going to create us a finishing issue. So let's take a look at that. Okay, let's look at a couple ways that we can get color on pine. That's the tough part. I'm going to put some gloves on because I already got dye all over my hands from opening the cans. Okay. One of the things we have to do in order to get a good, even color is we have to somehow equalize the surface. Meaning we already seen and we already know we have adverse absorption rates. So it's going to take a color different because of the different grains. And this isn't just true of pine, this is true of so many woods. You know, maples and cherry and some of the ones we mentioned, you know, alder, aspen. The list, it's a huge list of woods that do what's called blotch. Now you saw it on this side already, but I'm going to take a little darker dye and hit this. And on this ponderosa pine, it actually doesn't look super bad, but it's there. And you can see what's happening. And it will intensify as the color goes in. Now let's talk about colors. You have basically two types. You have a dye and you have a stain. Dyes are absorbed by the wood. It soaks right into the wood and becomes an integral part of it. Stains soak in a little, but predominantly they lay on the surface and don't absorb as much. The heavier, the thicker the stain, the better. There's products out here called gel stains. Gel stains are predominantly oil-based, meaning they have an oil structure to them. That's what they're made from. The term is, it's the medium by which the pigment, and if you think about pigments are like zillions of little BBs of color that we're going to glue onto the surface. And the oil is the glue that glues it on. In water-based products, it's a little bit different. Now, at the time of this filming, in most states, you can still get an oil-based gel stain. In a lot of states, you can't. But one of the things it does, because it lays on the surface, it doesn't blotch quite as bad as a dye stain will. Quick tip, when you're dealing with anything oil, when you dispose of your used cloths, make sure you hang them out. Don't pile them up. You hang them out to let them dry. These can cause spontaneous combustion very easily. It's a very dangerous thing, so be careful. In the water base, one of my favorites is the General Finish products. And it's water-based, so I don't have the oil or anything to contend with. But it's also a nice, thick, heavy base. It's as close to a water-based gel stain as you're going to get at present. And it too helps blotching to a degree. But it's also a very intense stain. I much prefer water-based colorants over oil-based. But as you can see, you're still not getting an even coloring. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's dramatic enough, it's very attractive. But typically, it's not. And this particular piece of pine is really not all that bad, but let's look at a different one. Here's that piece of yellow pine. This is yellow pine plywood. And the reason for the black on this was actually a piece of what's called T111 that had the grooves in it. We just sanded it down a little bit. But it's yellow pine. Yellow pine compared to the ponderosa pine will have far bigger and larger hard and soft grains in it. I think the ponderosa pine predominantly comes from the Pacific northwest in Canada. Same one, if we use a dye on it, you can definitely see that a dye is more readily absorbed than a stain. But dyes also are crisper, clearer, and usually they're stronger and do a better job of coloring. How do you tell? We have a video on YouTube here as well on the difference in stains and dyes. And basically, a dye will stay in solution. Meaning, if you're stirring it up and you've got the goop in the bottom, odds are you have a stain. A dye, that's not the case. Some stains, and they're all called stains, understand that. There's no differentiation predominantly, especially in box store products, of the difference between a dye and a stain. A dye stain combination, if you stick a stick in it and you pull it out and the top of the stick is clear and there's goop in the bottom of the can, you have a pure stain. Means it has pigment and oil. End of story. On the other hand, if the stick is colored and there's goop in the bottom, you have a stain dye combination. If you stick the stick in and there's nothing in the bottom and it's colored, you have a pure dye. The way it works. And the can's not going to tell you that. But as you can see, dyes penetrate and blotch worse than stains. Now, an alternative to, and this is predominantly done because you're brushing or wiping. When you do that, the application method of a brush or a cloth rag or stain pad or whatever allows the soft grain to be able to absorb more colorant than the hard grain. An alternative to that is to spray a dye or a stain if it's thin enough. Now I have to caution you, because stains have binder in it. That's the term that's given to the glue. You can't just keep piling stain on. If you do that, you're going to create an adhesion issue. So you can't just spray and spray and spray a stain. You can a dye, because a dye has no binder in it. It's taken onto the wood. Now, this is a water base, and I should have a mask on, but I'm showing you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step around here just so you can see a little bit about spraying a dye. It doesn't take you long to see that I'm getting a relatively even color, pretty even color. And I would let that dry, then I can keep adding as much dye as I want in order to get a nice even coating or color. Why is that working? The reason that's working, and you notice when I sprayed it, we used the term, what I did was we used a dry spray. Meaning we were putting very light coats and not getting the wood wet. Just light coats. Because what's happening is that the dye, the soft grain, can't absorb what's not there. Spraying is laying down a uniform amount of material, unlike the brush or the stain pad or the sponge or the rag. And so the wood can't absorb something that's not there. So that allows us to get a nice even coating. However, most guys don't have the ability to spray. There's out here that there's all kind of different pre-stain conditioners. All I'm going to tell you is that you have to experiment with them. Some work, sorta. Most don't. Just facts. What a pre-stain conditioner does is it is applied for the wood to absorb, to equalize the surface so that the absorption rate is even. But there's a trade-off for that. The trade-off is, as you seal the wood is going to absorb less color. So you have an issue with color retention. And it's a delicate balance. Again, there's a lot of commercially made ones. And a lot of guys prefer to use shellac in what's called a half-pound cut. And to keep this video on time, you're just going to have to Google or go out here and search on shellac and pound cuttage to understand that. Which is a very thin shellac, and they use it to try to equalize the surface of the material. But one of the keys to finishing any wood that blotches or finishing anything of that nature, and particularly pine, again, is equalizing the surface. And we're going to come back and take a look at that. I went back here and dug out this piece of plywood that we had used in one of our finishing classes, and we took pretty much all the popular or accessible pre-stains or blotch control that we could find, except this end, and this is a half-pound cut of shellac underneath of a die, and this is a 1-pound cut. This shows you what I'm talking about. You're giving up, the more you seal it, the less color it's going to take. Just the way it works. The other thing with dyes is that dyes will actually dye a little deeper. And then each one performed in various degrees of success. This one is ours. And that's what we use, and that's just what's on for a blotch control for us. But here's the key. You've got to do something to help control that absorption rate when you're dealing with pines or any of the blotching woods. Poplar is also a blotching wood. But like I told you, one of the nice things about poplar is that it's a heavier, denser, tighter grained wood. It's much more friendly to work with. I've often said poplar is probably one of the best furniture woods, or any wood for that matter, that there is. It's strong. It's heavy. Not heavy as in weight. It's just strong, nice tight grain, very stable, just an excellent wood. Problem with poplar is that it typically is very blah. It doesn't have a lot of grain to it. Now the other thing with poplar, and I see this out here on the forums and everything a lot, is guys want to go natural with poplar. Because while I don't have any here, poplar can have some, you can see it can have a light green. That's very typical in poplar. And again, unfortunately I don't have any that's got the green in it, but you can have green in it. You can have streaks of purple and yellow, and you can have some that has an extremely dark green in it. If you're going to be staining or dyeing something, you want to avoid the dark greens and the purples and the dark colors. Remember something. To get a nice even color, you're going to have to go as dark as the darkest part of that wood. That's just the way it works. There's some bleaches and things you can do to lighten stuff, but they're caustic and they're expensive. So the best thing to do is kind of like the knots, is to avoid it. And I don't mean to jump around. but I am, because that just brought up, I just remembered I forgot to show you this. On this knot, you notice you've got a light brown knot, and you don't have the dark membrane around it. This is a tight knot. It's not going anywhere. Now, the other thing in pines is that knots can also weep. They can literally weep sap. Again, avoid something like that. Avoid sap pockets in pine, and I don't have any here to show you because, well, I avoided it. But it will show up as a almost translucent, sticky streaks in it. The only thing I know of that will seal off pine resin is shellac, is a coat of shellac, and it will seal it down. Okay, but again, getting back to how you get a color. Poplar also blotches. It's not as bad as some of the pines, but it does blotch, unless you have some type of a good pre-stain on it. And if you have a good pre-stain on it, you can get nice even coloring. And I see a lot and one of the reasons I'm doing this is people are like, well, you can't make poplar look like anything. Well, I disagree. You can make poplar because of its typically neutral background color, as well as pine. You can make them look like just about anything that you want. This is a rosewood. This is the rosewood general finish water-based stain. There's your, all of this has the blotch control. There's your mahogany. Let's try the same thing on this piece of yellow pine plywood. Same plywood, except it's got a pre-stain treatment on it. Now you're still seeing some of this coming through. This is a case where it may have needed 3 coats. You have to experiment a little bit. But that's a relatively even coloring. Actually, it's enhancing some of the grain and giving it some right nice looking grain there. See what else we got over here. This is a little cinnamon general finish product dye. And you know it's a dye because it says so. Dye stain right on the can. How many guys out there like natural cherry? That's yellow pine plywood. Let's try some on poplar. Let it dry a little while. Give it another coat. You can keep darkening the color. But they dye. Let's take a look at one very quickly that doesn't have any pre-stain on it. And again, depending upon the poplar, it's going to depend upon how much blotching you're going to get. So that's the way it works. Now, let's go back a little bit Oh yeah, let's don't forget this guy. I was playing with him a little bit, and I was curious as to whether, with a good pre-stain, whether we could even make something like this salvageable. Well, I'm not going to tell you that this would certainly be my choice, but we've got a nice even color. So here's what we've learned. Let's recap. Working with pines requires several things. First, you have to understand sanding them. Like I said, we'll typically start to do our leveling and smoothing, particularly on the woods that have the heavy winter summer, with a coarse grit sandpaper or a scraper. Woods like white pine, spruce, fir, if they're a nice clean grain, straight grain, and you don't have a lot of the heavy summer, winter grains in it, you don't have to go to as coarse a grit. But they also cut very fast. White pine, spruce, fir, these woods are very soft and they will sand very, very fast. So go easy with them. Typically, when I'm sanding pine, I will take it up through 180, a P180 grit. I don't go much further than that. Now, the other thing we can do is we can sand up to a 220 and actually go up to a 320 if you want. The finer you sand the pines, or any wood for that matter, the less blotch prone they are. And the reason for that is that the fine sandpaper has a tendency to seal off the wood. I've never seen much benefit of going past 320. I've seen people out here who would literally sand something with 1,000 grit sandpaper. That's not necessary. The other thing that you're going to run into is if you're using a water-based product, water base is going to raise the grain. A good way to handle that is simply to give everything a nice wiping with a damp cloth, then do your final sand. That's working with pines. I hope this helps you understand just a little bit of how to get color on pine. The most critical and crucial part is to be able to equalize the surface of the wood and not seal it off too much so that you can get an even color. That's the crucial part. You got to get out here, you're going to have to play. And then you're going to have to play with how many coats you put on. All, different pines, as we've referred to them, will have different characteristics. So, just so you have a little bit of an understanding. And to sum this up, like I said in the beginning, most of you guys are out here, pine is where you start. But I will say this. It is probably one of the most frustrating woods to work with, and it is probably the most frustrating wood to try to finish. So if you're a new woodworker and you're just getting into it, what you're going to find is that, and you're having frustrations with it, I've been at it a long time. Pine still frustrates me too. So sometimes it's just the wood choice. I'm Charles Neal. I'll catch you later.